Of all the deaths in Hollywood's golden age, none are as suspicious as what happened to George Reeves on June 16, 1959. Just after midnight, the man who played Superman on TV lay dead in his bedroom from a gunshot wound to the head. The police spent less than an hour at the scene. The official ruling came fast: death by his own hand. Case closed. But nothing about that night made sense. The gun and shell casing was found in a position that would not be possible if he killed himself, and there were no powder burns on his skin. To understand who might have killed George Reeves, you need to know what his life looked like in 1959. He was 45 years old and desperate. For 8 years, he'd been Superman on TV. Millions of kids loved him, but that role destroyed his career. Hollywood wouldn't give him any other opportunities. When he tried to get a part in the movie From Here to Eternity in 1953, test audiences laughed and yelled, "There's Superman." He didn't make the final cut. The show didn't pay well either. He wanted to leave after the second season, so they gave him a small raise to stay, but it still wasn't enough. He was stuck playing a character he'd grown to hate, making barely enough money, and unable to get other work. In 1958, the show got canceled. George was broke, and the bills were piling up, but his personal life was even messier. For about 3 years, George had been having an affair with a woman named Toni Mannix. She was a former showgirl, 8 years older than him. She was also married to Eddie Mannix, a powerful man at MGM Studios who, some said, had connections to organized crime. Here's the weird part. Eddie knew about the affair and didn't care. He was having his own affairs. Toni took care of George completely. She bought him a car. She bought him the house he lived in. Their relationship was out in the open. Then, in late 1958, George met Leonore Lemon. She was younger, wilder, and had been married twice before. She had a reputation for getting into fights at clubs in New York. George ended things with Toni to be with Leonore. Toni was heartbroken, but George's new relationship wasn't going well either. He and Leonore drank heavily and fought constantly. Leonore wanted to get married and expected George to be a wealthy Hollywood star, but he wasn't. He was broke, unemployed, and couldn't see a way out. Now, we get to the night of June 16, 1959. George and Leonore went out for drinks that evening. They came home around 11 p.m. George was tired and went upstairs to bed, but Leonore kept the party going. A writer named Robert Condon was staying with them and was still awake. Then, 2 of Leonore's friends showed up, wanting to party. At 1 a.m., George came stomping down the stairs and yelled at them to be quiet. He was furious. Then, he went back upstairs to his bedroom. This is where everything gets strange. After George went back upstairs, Leonore started making bizarre comments to her friends. She said, "He's going upstairs to shoot himself." Then, a single gunshot rang out. Leonore calmly said, "I told you." She predicted exactly what was about to happen before it happened. Nobody even called the police for 45 minutes. When cops finally arrived, they found George upstairs, naked, sprawled across his bed. He was dead from a gunshot to the right side of his head. A Luger pistol was on the floor between his legs. When police asked Leonore about her comments before the gunshot, she said she was only kidding. Even the Los Angeles Times mentioned there was an element of mystery to his death. When they published his obituary, George's mother, Helen, refused to accept that her son killed himself. She hired Jerry Geisler, a famous Hollywood lawyer, to investigate. He ordered a second autopsy. The examination found unexplained bruises on George's head and body, but those injuries were never properly looked into. Then, after being paid a lot of money, Geisler suddenly dropped the case after just 1 month. Let's break down why this case is so suspicious. First, no fingerprints were found on the gun. Not George's, not anyone's. The gun was completely clean. Second, no gunpowder residue was found on George's hands. When you fire a gun, especially close to your body, there's usually residue left behind. Third, witnesses said they heard 1 gunshot that night. But when investigators checked, they found 3 bullets had been fired from the gun. Where did the other 2 bullets go? When were they fired? Nobody knows. Fourth, the shell casing was found underneath George's body. When a gun fires, the casing gets ejected away from the gun. If George shot himself and then fell, how did the casing end up under him? He would have had to fall directly on top of it in the exact right position. George's co-star, Noel Neill, who played Lois Lane, didn't believe he killed himself. She saw him just 2 days before he died. She said he was full of life, talking about movies he was going to make, a tour of Australia, and directing new episodes. She said George was enjoying life to the fullest. He was happy and almost gleeful. So if George didn't kill himself, what really happened that night? There are three main theories. Theory 1. Leonore Lemon killed him, possibly by accident. George was furious when he came downstairs that night. Some people think after he went back upstairs, Leonore followed him and they got into a huge fight. Maybe George told her he wasn't going to marry her. Maybe she grabbed the gun in anger. Maybe it went off accidentally. Maybe it didn't. Leonore was investigated as a suspect, but no physical evidence linked her to the shooting. Theory 2. Toni Mannix had George killed. Toni was devastated when George left her for Leonore. Some people believe she was so heartbroken that she arranged his murder. And here's the thing that makes this theory interesting. 15 years after Toni died in 1983, a publicist named Edward Lozzie made a shocking claim. He said he once overheard Toni confessing to a priest. According to Lozzie, Toni admitted she had George killed. We can't verify if this confession really happened, but it adds to the mystery. Theory 3. Eddie Mannix ordered the hit. Eddie was tired of his wife being heartbroken over George. Maybe he decided to solve the problem permanently. George's house was known as an open house where people came and went freely. Some believe Eddie, with his alleged mob connections, sent someone to the house during the party that night. They could have easily walked in, shot George, and left without anyone noticing during all the chaos. Eddie died in 1963, just 4 years after George. He never faced any investigation. But not everyone buys the murder theories. Jack Larson, who played Jimmy Olsen on the Superman show, thought the Eddie Mannix theory was ridiculous. He said Eddie was retiring and wouldn't risk everything by having someone killed. Some experts also say the lack of powder burns doesn't prove anything. When a gun is pressed directly against skin, the powder can go into the wound instead of burning the outside. So that evidence might not mean what people think it means. And some argue the shell casing position makes sense. If George held the gun in a natural position, the casing could have ejected behind him onto the bed, and then he fell on it. Jack Larson knew what George was going through. After playing Jimmy Olsen, he also got typecast and couldn't find work. He was depressed. He said he believed George took his own life because he understood that pain. We know the investigation was terrible. Basic evidence wasn't collected. They closed the case almost immediately without asking the hard questions. We know George's life was falling apart. No career, no money, a toxic relationship. He'd made powerful enemies by leaving Toni. But we also know he seemed happy days before he died. His friends said he had plans and seemed excited about the future. In 1959, forensic science wasn't what it is today. If this happened now, investigators would have tested everything: DNA, fingerprints, blood spatter patterns, gunpowder residue. They would have questioned everyone for hours. They would have recreated the scene. But back then, the cops showed up, looked around, and then made a decision. They didn't want to dig deeper. Maybe they didn't care. The man who could fly on television couldn't escape whatever happened in that bedroom. And the mystery of how he really died remains one of the darkest unsolved cases in Hollywood history.